In this video, I'm going to be doing something a bit different. I'm going to be showing and explaining a diagram of the central mechanisms of ME-CFS according to the research of Professor Klaus Wirth and Professor Carmen Scheibenbogen. Now, I find their research very exciting because what it does is it tries to join up the dots of the pre-existing ME-CFS research. In other words, it actually is trying to work out what is the interrelationship between all the different biomedical findings into this illness, how does X lead to Y, lead to Z, and also how are these problems actually part of a series of vicious cycles. So how does Z lead back into X, and so on. So in this video we're going to be talking about three main problems: the autonomic dysfunction, the issues with blood hyperperfusion, that is an underperfusion of blood throughout the body and why that happens, and the cellular issues, particularly in the muscle cells, and how all of these actually interrelate and drive each other. What I really want you to take away from this video is not only an understanding of a highly convincing model of what ME-CFS probably is, but also I hope you can see how initially all these different problems seem random and disparate, but actually they are part of one big vicious cycle, and within that vicious cycle there are all these smaller vicious cycles which are self-sustaining and driving each other, but ultimately, as I say, it's all just one vicious cycle. Now, the diagram that I am showing you comes from my new book, Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, which has a foreword by Professor Klaus Wirth in which he talks about the development of his research in this regard. And my book is really aimed at communicating the model I'm presenting here in an accessible way for other patients and carers and interested parties, as well as talking about treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my own quality of life as an ME-CFS patient. Links for that are down below. But let's now get into the diagram. I'm just going to show you a video of it, and I will look forward to your thoughts on it in the comments. So here is the simplified diagram of what ME-CFS is according to the research of Klaus Wirth and Carmen Scheibenbogen. And I'm going to be breaking down this diagram for you and showing you how all of these problems actually interrelate as a series of vicious cycles that are sustaining themselves, and how ultimately ME-CFS is just one big vicious cycle. So let's start up at the top here. There's the autonomic dysfunction and the excessive sympathetic nervous system. So this is the idea of the sensitized brain, the dysregulated autonomic nervous system, the traumatized brain, and it's sending out all of these different chemical messengers, which are excessive flight or fight messengers, and this is causing problems elsewhere in the body. In particular, if we go over here, it is causing problems in the blood vessels. So it's doing this for two reasons. One is, and this is actually not mentioned on the diagram, but one is that the excessive adrenaline release and norepinephrine and all these kinds of chemical messengers are increasing the vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. So they're tightening up the blood vessels in and of themselves. And just to be clear, this is the blood vessels in the muscles and in the brain, not the central blood vessels which are concerned with blood flow return to the heart. We'll come to those in a moment, but this is in the muscles. And so it's causing vasoconstriction of the muscles there. But it is also, because of the continuous waves of these chemical messengers, it is also causing desensitization of the beta-2 adrenergic receptor situated in the blood vessel muscles. And this desensitization of the receptor inhibits blood vessel vasodilation, so opening up of blood vessels in the muscles. So the joint effect coming from the autonomic dysfunction and excessive sympathetic nervous system on the blood vessels in the muscles and brain is one of excessive vasoconstriction, and closely tied with that, the inability to vasodilate. So the upshot is that there's a reduction in blood perfusion into the muscles and brain, which already makes sense of an illness of exercise intolerance and brain fog and cognitive dysfunction. Now, I have this part here, receptor blocking by autoantibodies. I'm going to come back to that. I want you just to hold that in your head for the moment. So we have already, as I say, an immediate reason for the muscular and cerebral blood vessel vasodilation reduction and just blood perfusion reduction. And as I say, that leads into then this skeletal muscle and cerebral blood hypoperfusion. As you'll see here, I have a couple of other things leading into the muscle and brain blood hypoperfusion, microclots and low CO2. I'm going to come back to those a little later and explain why they're coming about and what they're doing. But I just want to stay focused here on the most important mechanisms, the more upstream mechanisms that are going on. Okay, so we then end up in this situation where the body is underperfusing with blood in the muscles and brain. Now, the body does not like this, and for example, when a healthy person wants to go for a run, the blood flow into their muscles normally increases 20 to 30 times in comparison to when they are at rest. Now, because of these issues here, that's not able to happen, and the body has to find a backup solution in order to increase blood flow into the muscles when someone tries to take exercise, when they have ME-CFS, and even in general at times, because the blood flow is so poor, even when someone's not exercising, the body is also trying to increase the flow of blood in the muscles because it senses, and brain, because it senses that this is a very bad state of affairs and it's very stressful on the body. So it has this kind of backup system which comes from something called the kallikrein-kinin system, which is capable of producing a range of vasodilating molecules within the skeletal muscle. This includes a molecule called bradykinin. And so it creates these in excess in order to try and open up the blood vessels and get blood in to the muscles, because it's not able to do this in the normal ways. So that's what it does, and the healthy body will do this as well to some extent during exercise, but in ME-CFS it's excessive, and it's excessive because the body is desperately trying to improve blood flow, given that it cannot do so for the standard reasons. When you produce a lot of these molecules, yes, they will help to open up the blood vessels, but there's so many of them and they're so powerful that they actually spill over out of the muscles and they go into the bloodstream and they end up going all around the body and causing havoc and damage. And when these molecules from the kallikrein-kinin system reach the kidneys, they have a very distinct and disastrous physiological effect from the point of view of the ME-CFS patient. The kallikrein-kinin system operates in opposition to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and so when these molecules reach the kidneys, they will suppress kidney function. Now, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system works on the kidneys in order to maintain salt levels in the body. But when these molecules reach the kidneys, they actually cause salt loss because they suppress the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And this means that when the ME-CFS patient is going to the toilet, they are peeing out more salt than normal. And so their blood volume is lowering over time. And because of these same mechanisms, their body cannot then actually return the blood volume to normal. So they start to get low blood volume, and it can get pretty bad, even a litre or more less than it should be. These compensatory molecules also cause another problem, which is microvascular leakage. So they are, again, so powerful that they not only cause these kidney issues, but when they reach blood vessels elsewhere in the body, they actually cause these little microscopic tears through which blood will escape from the active circulation and go into the interstitial space, where it's no longer playing a role in the circulation, in the active circulation. The blood that escapes through these little microscopic leaks will end up being taken up by the lymphatic system and returned to the active circulation, but that process will take time. So it's a kind of temporary loss of blood volume from these molecules. Okay, so this then, once you get this low blood volume coming about, it starts to create strain on the heart, and the heart doesn't have so much blood to work with, so it starts to develop a low cardiac output state, which means that the heart is pumping an inadequate amount of blood around the body, and there is therefore reduced tissue perfusion for yet another reason. So that's why I have this arrow here, which is going back into the skeletal muscle and cerebral blood hypoperfusion. So we already have, the blood vessel issues. They're not able to vasodilate in the muscles. They're not able, and there's excessive vasoconstriction causing hypoperfusion, and that then leads to this secondary consequence of the low blood volume via various means, which in and of itself, actually, you could even do an arrow from this one into the blood hypoperfusion here. But this leads to low cardiac output state, preload failure, a lack of adequate blood flow return to the heart, which then feeds into and further worsens the hypoperfusion that's going on. So already I hope you're seeing how there's this, there are these vicious cycles. Once you have the low blood volume causing this cerebral and muscle hypoperfusion, that will further increase these compensatory molecules because the body's going to freak out even more, and then it goes like that. So I hope you're seeing how these are vicious cycles. Now over here there's another issue. This is very important. This is more caused by autoantibodies that tend to develop. We'll talk about them in a moment. The autoantibodies tend to develop for secondary reasons, but then they actually worsen the primary problems, which is a real theme. But I mentioned that up here we have the excessive vasoconstriction and lack of vasodilation in the muscles, but that problem isn't what happens everywhere. So in the more central capacitance veins and vessels, these are sort of larger blood vessels concerned with return of blood flow to the heart. There's actually the opposite problem happening, which is that there is a reduction in vasoconstriction. So these blood vessels remain too open, too loose, and this means that there is an ineffective return of blood flow upwards. And so we get this blood pooling, and this is why some people do well with midodrine, which constricts blood vessels. So this is happening because of autoantibodies in the blood, in these particular blood vessels that are concerned with blood flow return up to the heart, and it can also happen because of collagen issues like Ehlers-Danlos or joint hypermobility, because in those cases the blood vessels can lose their tautness, they become looser. And it may also happen because of mast cell activation issues. But basically, you get this problem happening here, which in and of itself also feeds into the low cardiac output state and the preload failure, which further feeds back into the hypoperfusion and further feeds back into this vicious cycle. Okay. Excellent. And this kind of combined effect of the blood hypoperfusion will further worsen the rest of the illness. I'm going to come back to this theme, but when you have the hyperperfusion, the autonomic nervous system and the brain starts to freak out even more and become more and more stressed. And so what we've discussed so far will feed right back into the ANS dysfunction, worsen it, and therefore worsen these problems here, and therefore the whole cascade gets worse. Now we're going to move on to thinking about how this is all affecting the function of the cells, the muscle cells. So before we get going, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm talking about stuff that's going on in the cells themselves. I am not talking at this point about what's going on in the bloodstream. When things like sodium and potassium and calcium are mentioned, people often think this is to do with, the blood results you would get in your standard labs. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about problems that develop within the actual muscle cells themselves. So this is intracellular problems, and basically think of it actually as problems within the muscles. Okay, so the muscle cells normally like to have the correct concentration of sodium and potassium, and in particular it wants to ensure that it is clearing more sodium from the cell than potassium. This is what allows for the cell to be happy and functional. And when you get dysfunctions in cellular concentrations of these ions, then the muscles can start to become unhappy and work far less well. So this is what's happening in ME-CFS. First of all, if we go back down to this general kind of skeletal muscle and cerebral blood hypoperfusion, that is directly feeding into a dysfunction that starts to develop in the muscle cells, because the cells depend upon a healthy supply of oxygen and blood in order to function, and so this is being reduced, and therefore the function of the cells is being reduced. Also, because this hypoperfusion lowers the anaerobic threshold, and patients are crashing because of that, they're getting exercise intolerance. This also causes a dysfunction of the sodium-potassium pump, because even in healthy people, when the anaerobic threshold is triggered, there are temporary problems that exist in the pump that it has to resolve before it's functioning well again. But what's very interesting is that the dysfunction of the beta-2 adrenergic receptor directly plays into, in a very pivotal way, the dysfunction of the sodium-potassium pump in the muscles. So the sodium-potassium pump is, as I say, this means of ensuring that there's the correct concentration of sodium and potassium inside the cell, and when it becomes dysfunctional, you start to get a build-up of sodium and a reduction in potassium. So this beta-2 adrenergic receptor issue is itself directly impacting the sodium-potassium pump, because the pump's activity in large part depends upon the beta-2 adrenergic receptor working well. Okay, so we start to get this dysfunction as a response to other mechanisms in the illness. This then leads to higher sodium concentrations intracellularly in the muscles. And this was proven in a research study by Wirth and Scheibenbogen, in which they actually used MRI technology to measure the sodium concentrations of ME-CFS patients in their muscles, and it was found that it was almost twice as high after an exercise challenge, and it was also higher at resting. So that proved their hypothesis. So there's high intracellular sodium that occurs, and that in and of itself is bad enough, because that will cause muscle weakness, easy fatigability. It ties in with one of the findings in ME-CFS research of reduced hand grip strength. So this is really showing us that the muscles, this is one of the main reasons why the muscles are so weak. But it causes another problem. So when you get high intracellular sodium, you are very close from going over a certain threshold which actually causes high cellular calcium levels, calcium overload, which is a very damaging state for the cells. This happens because there's a threshold at which something called the calcium exporter, the cellular calcium exporter, actually starts to become dysfunctional and goes into reverse mode and begins to actually import calcium into the cell rather than export it, and this leads to calcium overload. So the muscles at a certain point become overloaded with calcium, and for Wirth and Scheibenbogen this is post-exertional malaise. It is what causes those awful symptoms where you can't move, can't lift your head, can't turn over, etc., etc. It is the calcium overload that is the actual mechanism of post-exertional malaise. And this is not just because it feels awful in and of itself, but it also will directly damage the mitochondria within the cell, and it will lower their quantity. So this gives us an explanation for why mitochondrial problems actually develop in ME-CFS. It will also create lower ATP, and this extremely important finding from the work of Appelman and Vust from the Netherlands in early 2024 in their paper Muscle Abnormalities Worsen Post-Exercise in Long Covid, who actually found that during post-exertional malaise some of your muscle fibers actually die. There's tissue necrosis, and this can be explained by the cellular calcium toxicity, because it actually can cause cell death and therefore muscle fiber death. So these are the central mechanisms of post-exertional malaise. That's why it feels so awful. Because this further increases the vicious cycles, because when you get lower ATP levels caused by this damage, that actually feeds back into the sodium-potassium pump issues, because ATP also has an effect on the healthy functioning of the pump. And so therefore you then get another vicious cycle within a vicious cycle in which higher intracellular sodium levels become more established, and you become ever closer to tipping over more and more easily into the cellular calcium overload and post-exertional malaise. So that's the kind of interaction between the hypoperfusion, the dysfunctioning of the beta-2 adrenergic receptor, and the cells. And again, all of these problems that we have just been describing will feed back into the autonomic dysfunction, which will then keep worsening these problems, the initial problems over here. So it's all vicious cycles. Now, we're going to come to a few other little things, which will then round things off. Let's go first of all to autoimmunity over here. So there's an autoimmune burden which further worsens the perfusion and cellular dysfunctions. Now, there's a specific kind of autoimmune problem that occurs in ME-CFS, which is called, and they are autoantibodies against G-protein coupled receptors. These include autoantibodies against beta-1 receptors, beta-2 receptors, muscarinic 3 receptors, alpha-1 receptors. And these are kind of different from normal autoimmune problems in that they are not like breaking the body down, as in rheumatoid arthritis, but they are actually interfering with cellular function, making it dysfunctional and further impacting the central mechanisms that are ongoing in ME-CFS. So these, first of all, to say these problems develop most likely secondarily to the rest of the illness. In other words, everything else that's happening is so stressful on the body that these autoantibodies start to get produced in higher quantities, or at the very least to become pathological, because you can actually, as a healthy person, have a significant number of these autoantibodies, but they're not actually exerting a pathological effect, whereas in ME-CFS they definitely are. So anyway, the illness itself probably encourages the overproduction or pathological nature of the autoantibodies. However, it's also possible that initial triggers like viral infections or COVID could also set it off. And it's possible that the general lowering of just energy in the cells of the body can increase these autoantibodies. So I say that these further worsen the perfusion and cellular dysfunctions. So basically they're best thought of as a problem that develops most likely secondarily, but then develop a range of effects that worsen the illness on top of, in addition to and on top of the other problems. So it's like a further layer of burden that then makes everything else worse and heightens the other issues that already exist. So there's actually about 10 or 12 of these autoantibodies, and they all exert effects that ultimately are all further worsening the blood perfusion and cellular issues. But just to give examples of 4 of them, the beta-1 receptor autoantibodies will actually go and kind of burrow themselves into and live in the heart tissue and further worsen its capacity to pump. And beta-1 autoantibodies are actually found in heart failure as well. So they worsen the heart pumping capacity, which then feeds into down here the low cardiac output state, and then further worsens the hypoperfusion for that reason. You then have the anti-beta-2 autoantibodies, which, if we go over here, I said I would come back to this, the receptor blocking by autoantibodies up here. So these autoantibodies will attach themselves to the beta-2 adrenergic receptor in the muscles, in the blood vessels in the muscles, and act as another reason for blocking the signal to vasodilate. And this therefore will further increase the reduction in blood perfusion in the illness and worsen those aspects of the cycle. And then we have the antimuscarinic 3 autoantibodies, which also will worsen blood perfusion because antimuscarinic 3 autoantibodies go and live in the endothelium, the general endothelium throughout the body, so this is everywhere, and actually cause a reduction in blood perfusion. They also, interestingly, can live in the parts of the body that produce moisture and cause them to dry up because it inhibits moisture production. And finally, the anti-alpha-1 autoantibodies, these are the ones that will go into the central capacitance vessels and veins and inhibit vasoconstriction when you stand up, and thereby feeding into the low cardiac output state from that angle and the hypoperfusion. Okay, so that's how the autoimmunity works. So you can see how it then embeds itself and worsens everything else that's happening, including, of course, again, just for the reasons I've already mentioned, but in the nervous system. And what they have found is that when mice were injected with autoantibodies from long COVID patients, they actually developed dysautonomia just for that reason. Okay. Then we come over here. So there's the microclots and the low CO2. Now these are kind of small boxes, but they are still a big deal. But both of them are really developing from the rest of the illness. So the microclots, these microscopic clots, which condense the bloodstream, make it darker in colour, thick and sluggish, and impact the transfer of oxygen from the bloodstream into the muscles and brain, yet another reason. They most likely develop because of the inflammatory nature of the illness, which can encourage clotting. It's quite a distinct feature. The work of Richa Pretorius is important for this. But they develop secondarily. They might also be triggered initially, again, by infections, by COVID. So there could be a kind of starter way in which this also helps start things off. But basically secondarily, and once the microclots develop, this further worsens the skeletal muscle and cerebral blood hypoperfusion and therefore feeds into all the other mechanisms. And similarly, low carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is not a waste gas, it is essential for health, but and it also plays a role in vasodilating blood vessels and increasing blood perfusion and tissue oxygenation. But in ME-CFS, there develop low levels of CO2, and this is happening almost certainly as a response to everything else on the screen. So basically, because there's such a reduction in blood perfusion and tissue oxygenation elsewhere, the body starts to also develop low CO2 as a kind of response to that. But once it develops, it then further feeds into the blood hypoperfusion. So those issues then worsen everything else. And this is the kind of big theme. The general state of ill health, the physiological stress of the illness from all the illness mechanisms combined, will lead, as I see from the arrow here, going up and through into the autonomic dysfunction. Such an important point. And then everything stays going on. Everything keeps going. It's all a series of vicious cycles. The general state of ill health can also lead to other problems, such as lowered adrenal and thyroid output, development of gut dysfunctions, and slower lymphatic flow. And then those problems will in turn feed back into the general state of ill health and all the other issues. So that is, in a nutshell, according to Wirth and Scheibenbogen, a simplified version of what ME-CFS is. So we can see how it is an illness of vicious cycles. Everything is leading to everything else. This is such a difficult cycle to get out of if you're a patient, because so many things are actually, maintaining the illness. It's like ME-CFS is like a boat that's being weighed down by 100 anchors. And when you crash, all of these mechanisms become heightened, or most of them become heightened, and then the body has to actually recover from that. So it's a very difficult illness to get out of, and what you can also see is that so many things are stressing out the nervous system and brain in the illness. This is an important point because so many people, the proponents of brain retraining, say that the only thing that's happening in the illness is this, the autonomic dysfunction, and that you just need to do brain retraining and all the symptoms are created by this. Some people even say ludicrous things like, it's all created by suppressed emotions and subconscious forces, right? So really, really ludicrous in light of this research. But they say that, but actually, although there is a sensitized brain in ME-CFS, which I strongly believe can respond to neuroplasticity, it's very important to have the big picture and see that all of these things are also feeding back into the autonomic stress. And this is why some people work on brain retraining for a long time and they might improve a bit, but they don't actually recover because all these other mechanisms are so embedded. On the flip side, it is feasible because some people do recover from ME-CFS, that targeting different points of the pathophysiology, particularly simultaneously, and doing brain retraining to help with the sensitization, and maybe having some more targeted conventional treatments, could lead to lifting of the anchors, enough of the anchors, that the body can actually do the rest of the job itself. But the main takeaway point from this video is A, ME-CFS is an illness of vicious cycles, and B, because they're all interrelated and actually, essentially it's all just one vicious cycle, to understand that this is why it is so hard to actually recover, because all of these things ultimately have to lift and resolve. And to be clear, I believe that in principle the body can do this. The body is an amazing healing organism, but this shows us just why it's so hard. So I hope you found this video helpful. I hope it's given you a clearer idea of what ME-CFS likely is. And yeah, that's it for now. So I will look forward to your comments and I'll see you in the next video.